Deep in the frozen valleys of the Yukon, something was buried that no one had touched in over 2 decades, and the man who found it never expected it would change his life forever. His name was Cole Whitman, a third-generation miner who had spent years chasing smaller and smaller pay dirt across claims that everyone else had given up on. What his crew uncovered that morning would turn into one of the strangest and most talked-about finds in recent mining memory. A rusted giant buried beneath the earth, hiding a secret that had been sitting untouched since the operation around it vanished without explanation. Stick with this story until the end, because what the crew found inside that machine raises more questions than answers, and the mystery only gets stranger from here. Cole Whitman had been working this stretch of ground for nearly 3 seasons, always chasing rumors of an old claim that had been shut down sometime in the late 90s. Locals talked about it in passing, an operation that packed up almost overnight and never came back. Nobody in town seemed to remember exactly why. Some said the company ran out of money. Others said the ground simply wasn't as rich as they thought. For years, the story faded into the background noise of small-town mining folklore, the kind of tale everyone has heard a version of, but nobody can confirm. Cole had heard it more times than he could count, but something about the way the old-timers avoided going into detail always stuck with him. It was early in the season when Cole decided to push his crew into a section of ground that hadn't been touched in his memory. The land was overgrown, thick with brush and small trees that had grown undisturbed for years. As the excavator began clearing the topsoil, the operator noticed the bucket catching on something solid beneath the surface, far too solid to be rock. Work stopped almost immediately. Cole walked over to inspect the area himself, running his hand along a patch of rusted metal poking through the dirt. It didn't take long before the entire crew gathered around, staring down at what looked like the edge of something massive still buried beneath the ground. Over the next several hours, the crew carefully cleared away the soil surrounding the object. What emerged was a trommel, the large cylindrical washing machine used to separate gold from gravel and dirt, but far bigger than anything Cole had worked with before. Caked in rust and half swallowed by roots, the machine still held its shape remarkably well for something that had clearly been sitting untouched for a very long time. Cole stood back, studying the scale of it, trying to piece together what kind of operation would have needed equipment this large. Whoever built this had invested serious money into this ground, and yet here it sat, abandoned and forgotten. As the crew continued digging around the machine, they started noticing something unusual in the surrounding soil. Small flecks of gold, more than what you'd typically expect to see just lying near the surface. Cole crouched down and sifted through a handful of dirt, watching the tiny specks catch the light. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was enough to make him pause. If gold was still visible in loose soil around an abandoned machine after all these years, it raised an obvious question. What had actually happened here, and why would anyone walk away from ground that still had color in it? Cole decided the responsible thing to do was pull samples before jumping to any conclusions. He'd seen enough seasons in this business to know that excitement without evidence gets miners into trouble fast. His crew collected material from several points around the trommel, packaging it carefully to be sent off for lab testing. While they waited on results, Cole spent his evenings digging through whatever old records he could find, county archives, claim registries, anything that might explain who had worked this ground before and why they left so abruptly. What he found only deepened the mystery. According to old filings, a mining operation had indeed worked this claim through the early to mid-90s, investing heavily in equipment and labor. Then, according to the paperwork, the operation simply stopped. No formal closure notice, no transfer of the claim, nothing indicating financial trouble or legal issues. It was as if the company had packed up and left in a hurry, leaving behind a piece of equipment worth a significant amount of money without any explanation. Cole sat with that information for a while, turning it over in his head. People don't usually walk away from expensive equipment unless something forced their hand. When the lab results finally came back, Cole gathered his crew to go over the numbers together. The samples showed gold concentrations noticeably higher than the average ground in that region, though nowhere near the kind of numbers that would suggest an untouched bonanza. Still, for ground that had already been worked once and then abandoned, the results were promising enough to justify a closer look. Cole made the call to bring in outside help, reaching out to a geologist he'd worked with in the past to get a professional read on what they were dealing with. The geologist arrived within the week, bringing along equipment for deeper testing and ground scanning that Cole's crew didn't have access to on their own. Over the following days, they drilled test holes at varying depths across the property, sending fresh samples out for analysis while running preliminary scans to map out what was happening beneath the surface. The process was slow and methodical, nothing like the instant answers people expect from television. Cole spent most of those days simply waiting, trying not to get ahead of himself while the data slowly came together. When the geologist finally sat down with Cole to go over the findings, the picture that emerged was more complicated than either of them expected. The ground did show elevated gold values in certain pockets, particularly in an area running along what looked like an old creek channel buried under years of sediment. The geologist explained that channels like this can hold gold that settled into the ground over thousands of years, and that the original operation may have only worked the upper layers before stopping, potentially missing richer material sitting deeper down. It wasn't a guarantee of anything spectacular, but it was enough to suggest the ground deserved a serious second look. Cole asked the question that had been sitting with him since the day they found the Trommel. Why would anyone leave equipment like this behind if the ground still had potential? The geologist didn't have a definitive answer, but offered a few possibilities based on what he'd seen in similar situations over the years. Sometimes operations run out of capital mid-project and simply can't afford to keep going, let alone haul out heavy equipment. Sometimes disputes over land rights or partnerships fall apart, and everything gets left in limbo. Without more documentation, there was no way to know for certain what happened here, only that something had clearly gone wrong for someone. With the geological data in hand, Cole faced a decision that weighed on him more than he expected. Committing to a full operation on this ground meant real financial risk, bringing in additional equipment, expanding his crew, and dedicating a season that could otherwise go toward claims with more predictable returns. He talked it over with his crew late one night around the fire, laying out the numbers as honestly as he could. The ground showed promise, but nothing was guaranteed. Everyone at that fire had seen promising ground turn into disappointment before, and they'd also seen overlooked ground turn into the best season of someone's career. In the end, the crew voted to move forward cautiously but committed. Getting the old Trommel operational again took more work than anyone anticipated. Cole's mechanics spent days going through the machine piece by piece, replacing corroded parts, checking the integrity of the drum, and making sure nothing would fail once they put material through it. There was something almost strange about bringing a piece of equipment back to life after it had sat frozen in time for over 2 decades, like waking something up that had been left for dead. When the engine finally turned over and the drum began rotating for the first time in years, the entire crew stood around it in silence, watching a piece of forgotten history come back to work. The first real test came a few days later, once the crew had fed enough material through the machine to get a meaningful read on what the ground was actually producing. Cole stood near the recovery table as the first batch finished processing, watching closely as the concentrate was washed down for a cleanup. The amount of gold sitting in the pan wasn't a jaw-dropping fortune, but it was a strong, steady showing, noticeably better than what Cole typically pulled from ground he considered solid. For a first run on ground nobody had touched in over 20 years, it was enough to justify everything they put into getting here. As the days went on, the numbers stayed consistent. Not explosive, not the stuff of wild headlines, but dependable, respectable production that suggested this ground had genuinely been undervalued or misjudged by whoever worked it originally. Cole found a strange kind of satisfaction in that. There was no dramatic uncovering of a secret fortune, no instant windfall changing his life overnight. Instead, there was steady, honest work paying off in exactly the way mining is supposed to, patience and effort slowly turning into something real. Word of the find spread through the local mining community faster than Cole expected. People stopped by the site out of curiosity, wanting to see the old Trommel for themselves and hear the story of how it ended up buried in the first place. Cole found himself repeating the same details over and over: the abandoned claim, the mysterious lack of records explaining why the previous operation left, the gold still sitting in the soil after all those years. Every time he told it, someone had a new theory, though none of them could be confirmed. The truth was, and probably always would be, that nobody alive could say for certain what happened on that ground back in the 90s. Cole spent time reflecting on what the whole experience meant to him beyond the gold itself. He'd spent years working smaller, less promising ground, always chasing the next lead, always wondering if the big break was ever going to come. This wasn't some overnight fortune that changed everything instantly, but it was proof that persistence and a willingness to dig into ground other people had written off could still pay real dividends. For a miner who had put in years of quiet, unglamorous work, that meant more than any headline number ever could. As the season progressed, Cole's team continued working the channel they'd identified, following it as it wound through the property. Some sections produced better than others, a normal reality of placer mining that television often glosses over in favor of dramatic peaks and disasters. There were slow days mixed in with good ones, equipment breakdowns that ate into progress, and stretches where the crew wondered if they'd already found the best of what the ground had to offer. That unpredictability, Cole would tell you, is simply part of the job, and anyone who tells you otherwise is probably selling something. By the time the season wound down, Cole and his crew had turned an abandoned, mysterious piece of ground into a genuinely productive claim, breathing new life into equipment that had sat forgotten for over 20 years. The old Trommel, once buried and rusting under decades of overgrowth, was now a working part of his operation, a strange reminder of the unanswered questions still surrounding why it was left behind in the first place. Cole never did find a clear answer to that mystery, and he's made peace with the idea that he probably never will. Some stories in mining just don't come with tidy endings. What stuck with Cole most, looking back on the season, wasn't the mystery of the abandoned equipment or the steady gold it eventually produced. It was a reminder that ground written off by someone else doesn't always deserve that reputation. Sometimes it just needs a fresh set of eyes, a bit of patience, and someone willing to dig a little deeper than the last person did. That, more than any single number pulled from the ground, is the real story behind the forgotten Trommel and the miner who brought it back to life. If you enjoyed this story of mystery, patience, and the kind of steady payoff that real mining is actually built on, consider subscribing for more stories from the world of placer mining. And if you've got theories of your own about what really happened to that original operation, drop them in the comments below, because honestly, we're just as curious as Cole was.